Warning: the Curious Native podcast contains mature topics and themes that are intended for an older youth and adult audience. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey, welcome to the Curious Native Podcast. I'm your host, hunnasmak, and in today's episode, we will be taking a look at and talking about one of the world's most famous civil rights leaders and activists, a man who helped bring about the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. That's right. Today, we will be taking a look at and talking about the legacy and life of Martin Luther King Jr. and his accomplishments as a civil rights leader. So if you're interested, please keep on listening. Before we get into this, I do want to say, I'm going to apologize for, any little background noises you hear. It is, I live in a house with people. There's a lot of natives here. There's my mama. I have animals. There's all my kitties. I got my dog. I got my mom's dog. I got brother. I got my sister. I got just a lot of people here, okay? So if you hear, a little bit of noises in the background or anything, I just want to apologize, up front. And let's be honest, this is an old house that was converted into apartment, so there's a lot of creaking. My bed be creaking sometimes when I, film on my bed because I have an older bed that I need to get. I need to get a new bed. But, let's jump right into this. Born Michael King Jr., Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15th, 1929 to parents Michael and Alberta King. MLK's upbringing was rough. Even though King grew up in a middle-class family, there was still, emotional and physical abuse, which I know I'm going to bring this up, and I'm going to bring up something else in a minute, so I'm just clarifying. King's father would regularly discipline his children by whipping them and also by having them whip each other, which, I believe was it partially influenced his nonviolence stance and belief. I be struggling with English, and that's just what it is. This wasn't the only troubles and heartache King faced, as a young child growing up in the 1930s. As a young boy, King befriended a little white boy whose family owned a business across the street. Shortly after starting school at the age of 6, the white boy's parents stopped allowing the little boys to be friends. And the way they told King they couldn't be friends anymore was, quote, "We are white and you are colored," end quote. Devastated by the situation, King told his parents, to which they had to sit him down and have a discussion about the history of systematic racism in America and the history of slavery in the United States. Which I know I mentioned King's hardships with his father and the physical and emotional abuse he suffered, but his father taught him a lot of valuable lessons and inspired King Jr. to become, the civil rights leader that he became. I'm going to address this again in a moment. I just wanted to kind of bring up a few examples of how, if it wasn't for MLK Sr., MLK Jr. wouldn't have been the civil rights leader that, he grew up to be. MLK witnessed his father fight against various forms of racism and discrimination. Once, when his father took him to a shoe store in downtown Atlanta, the clerk told them they had to sit in the back. King Senior, I'm sorry, my notes are a little mixed up, argued that they would be staying in the front of the store and will only be buying from the front before leaving. Another example that I came across was one that I was actually I never heard about this, and to me it seems like such an important piece of history that should be talked about more. MLK Sr. led hundreds of black Americans in a civil rights march in 1936 to the City Hall in Atlanta to protest voting rights, which is, his son ended up doing the same thing when he became the powerhouse civil rights leader and activist that he grew up to be. I mentioned this, these situations about his father and the different things because not to excuse abuse, because abuse is not excusable and should never be excused. I just wanted to speak on what influenced and made MLK into the civil rights leader he was, and to do that, I had to speak on experiences that, informed his experience, and I think a lot of them were with his father, King Sr. So, I wanted to clarify that, the abuse that he suffered was not alright, but also at the same time, his father taught him a lot of valuable lessons when it came down to social justice, especially with racial discrimination. Now that you know a little bit about his early life, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the activism and accomplishments of MLK. So let's fast forward a tiny bit. After finishing college and earning his doctorate, King took up residency in Montgomery, Alabama. I am so sorry. I've never. Montgomery, Alabama. Okay. To become a pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church shortly after the Rosa Parks incident happened, which caused a tidal wave of protest against racial discrimination in the public transport system. One individual involved with these protests and marches were Martin Luther King Jr. Beginning in 1955 in Montgomery, black residents began staging extremely successful boycotts which lasted over 3 years. MLK played a leadership role in these boycotts, which led to his imprisonment, propelling King into the public image as a key figure in the civil rights movement. Speaking of a key figure and, just moments that propelled King up, I think it's time to talk about one of America's most famous protests and marches, the 1963 March on Washington. In 1963, King and the SCLC worked with the NAACP and other civil rights groups to organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which attracted more than 250,000 people to rally for the civil rights, economic rights of black Americans in the nation's capital. There, King delivered his 17-minute I Have a Dream speech, which is one of, the most famous civil rights speeches in history.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children be able to sing with new meaning, my country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when it happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Interesting enough, the 1963 March on Washington was originally conceived as a mass demonstration to protest the economic inequalities for a new federal jobs program at the moment, but soon evolved to include for call for action. So, yeah. Also, if anybody's curious about who organized this, the details and organization of the march were handled by Bayard Rustin, Randolph's trusted associate. Rustin was a veteran activist with extensive experience in putting together mass protests. With only 2 months to plan, Rustin established his headquarters in Harlem, New York, with a smaller office in Washington. And if you want to know about Bayard Rustin, go ahead and watch my Indigenous Icons episode about Bayard. It's literally the one right before this, so go ahead and give that a listen. And then, yeah, it's interesting. Bayard Rustin was a mentor to Martin Luther King, and ultimately, helped Martin Luther King also become who he was. Also, another thing about the March on Washington in 1963, the joint impact of the March on Washington on legislators and members of the public laid the foundation for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it opened a new window, and later the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this was extremely significant. King was such a significant, you know, figure in civil rights history. He was honored with dozens of awards and given honorary degrees for his achievements throughout his life and, even into death. In addition to receiving the Nobel Prize in 1964, King was awarded the NAACP Medal in 1957 and the American Liberties Medallion by the American Jewish Committee in 1965. After his death, though, King was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977 and received the Congressional Gold Medal in 1994 with his wife Coretta. I think the best way for me to end out this episode is, with a quote. March on Washington, August 28th, 1963. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a proclamatory note to which every American was to fall to hear. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. Martin Luther King Jr. And with that being said, Martin Luther King Jr. was a person. No figure is more closely identified with the mid-century struggle for civil rights than Martin Luther King Jr. King is remembered, as one of history's, America's, civil rights grandfather who, paved the way for all the activists and civil rights fighters we have today. They would not be here if it wasn't for King. Martin Luther King Jr. He dealt with so much during his run with civil rights. He was being blackballed by the United States government. He was being harassed by the CIA. They tried to create multiple fake videos put together about, him cheating on his wife with prostitutes. They tried to make him seem like he was selling government secrets. That was the whole thing that I didn't even get into because it was like to go through all that stuff. I feel like there would have to be more episodes, and I honestly I would love to make a part 2 to this Martin Luther King episode. And if you're interested in that, I'll love to do that. There were so many more things that I didn't even bring up because I just didn't have the time to do it. There was a lot. This episode, it was mentally, a lot, especially when I was reading about the abuse he suffered with his father. I've gone with a lot of stuff through my dad, so that was a lot. And even just reading about the shit he was going through with the government and the CIA and the FBI, it's just like, well, damn, this man cannot catch a break, and it was heavy. I'm not gonna lie, it was heavy. So, with that being said, please go ahead and like and subscribe to, get more podcasts, and it lets me know that you guys are liking this. Go ahead and comment too if you have any suggestions or anything, any tips you could give me to improve my podcast. I know there was a lot of ums, and normally with this I have like a layout for how I'm gonna speak about things, but for this I had a lot of notes and I just kind of winged it, which is the first time I've ever done this. So, if I decide to do it again in the future, it should be a lot more clean because I'll get a hang of it. I'll get the hang of it by then. With that being said, go ahead and follow me at my podcast official Twitter page at TCNPod, capital TCNP, lowercase OD. Go ahead and follow my main Twitter page at huskasmin iThine, lowercase HUSKA, uppercase S, lowercase MINI, uppercase T, lowercase HINE. And I'm hunnasmak, and this has been the Curious Native Podcast.